the system that worked only in the shadows. It functioned best when no one talked about it. The moment it drew attention, it weakened. Designed to operate quietly, it shaped outcomes across Europe while remaining almost completely unseen. And for a long time, that invisibility was its greatest strength. To understand why this system worked only in the shadows, we must return to an era obsessed with transparency. Regulations multiplied, disclosures expanded, oversight promised control. Yet beneath the visible framework, another layer emerged, informal, adaptive, and deliberately understated. It handled what formal systems could not. The first reveal begins with coordination outside official channels. Institutions shared expectations quietly. Practices aligned through habit rather than law. Problems were resolved before they became disputes. Nothing was written down because writing would have made it rigid. Flexibility required discretion, and discretion required darkness. The second beat followed as crises tested the arrangement. When rules proved too slow, the shadow system moved faster. Temporary understandings bridged gaps. Assumptions replaced approvals. Stability was reserved not through enforcement, but through mutual restraint. Everyone involved understood the cost of exposure. What made this effective was trust built on repetition, not authority. Participants knew the limits. They knew when to intervene and when to step back. The system did not aim to be fair. It aimed to be functional. And because it stayed out of sight, it avoided the scrutiny that might have frozen it. Over time, this quiet layer became essential. Formal structures depended on it to smooth edges and absorb shocks. Public order rested on private coordination no one officially acknowledged. The system thrived precisely because it was never named. But invisibility carries a risk. The moment a system becomes necessary, someone eventually asks who controls it, and what happens when the shadows are forced into the light. As the reveal deepened, the shadow system's role became clearer to those who relied on it. It was not a conspiracy, nor a single network. It was a habit of coordination formed through shared risk. When formal rules threatened collapse, informal alignment prevented it. Silence was not secrecy. It was efficiency. The conflict emerged when transparency collided with function. Investigations demanded documentation. Reforms required disclosure. Practices that worked precisely because they were flexible now risked being frozen into rules. Participants hesitated. Once written, discretion could be challenged. Once exposed, restraint could be mistaken for collusion. The buildup intensified as crises grew more complex. Formal systems expanded to cover every scenario, yet could never move fast enough. The shadow layer filled the gaps again and again. Temporary agreements stabilized markets. Quiet assurances prevented panic. The system proved indispensable, but also indefensible. No one could admit relying on something that officially did not exist. Pressure mounted from outside. Journalists searched for explanations behind sudden calm. Politicians demanded clarity about decisions they had not authorized. Public trust wavered as people sensed outcomes were being shaped somewhere beyond view. What had once been protective invisibility now looked like avoidance. Inside the system, unease spread. Participants knew exposure would weaken coordination, yet continued silence risked backlash. The very success of the shadow network made it suspect. Stability achieved without explanation invited suspicion, and suspicion demanded light. By this stage, the system faced its central dilemma: remain hidden and risk being dismantled by misunderstanding, or surface and risk losing the flexibility that made it work at all. The shadows had protected it, but the shadows were closing in. The tension peaked when exposure finally began. Fragments of the shadow system surfaced through leaks, inquiries, and conflicting testimonies. None revealed a single controller or master plan. What emerged instead was something harder to explain: a web of understandings maintained through experience rather than authority. To outsiders, it looked like evasion. To participants, it was the only way to keep the machinery from tearing itself apart. The conflict sharpened as formal institutions tried to absorb what they had never designed. Committees attempted to codify discretion. Regulators sought to replicate speed with procedure. Each attempt slowed response and narrowed judgment. What worked in motion stiffened when named. The shadow system resisted not out of defiance, but out of incompatibility. The buildup intensified during a fresh wave of instability. Markets trembled, rules triggered automatically. Yet it was the informal signals that calmed behavior. Quiet pauses, unwritten understandings. Decisions delayed just long enough to prevent cascade. The system did what it always had, operate between the lines, while the lines themselves proved too rigid. Public reaction grew harsher. How could outcomes be shaped without records? Who decided when silence was used? Trust eroded as people realized stability depended on arrangements they could not see or challenge. Even those who benefited felt uneasy. A system that could not explain itself could not claim legitimacy, no matter how effective. Inside the network, participants face a reckoning. Continued invisibility protected function, but invited suspicion. Visibility promised accountability, but threatened collapse. Some argue for formalization at any cost. Others warned that codifying discretion would destroy it. The debate split along experience, not ideology. Those closest to failure knew how thin the margin really was. By now, the paradox was unavoidable. The system worked only in the shadows because the shadows allowed judgment. But judgment without visibility bred distrust. Stability without explanation became fragile. The very tool that prevented crisis now risked becoming its cause. The question was no longer whether the shadow system should exist. It was how to bring light to it without breaking what made it work. The resolution did not come through full exposure or total secrecy. Europe chose a third path, partial light. The goal was not to illuminate every detail, but to acknowledge the system's existence and define its boundaries. Silence would no longer pretend to be absence. The climax unfolded when formal frameworks were redesigned to make space for judgment rather than eliminate it. Clear principles replaced rigid scripts. Accountability focused on outcomes, not transcripts. Institutions accepted that some discretion was necessary, and that pretending otherwise had only driven it underground. The shadow system did not disappear. It was reframed. This shift changed behavior on both sides. Informal coordination continued, but within declared limits. Triggers were clarified, responsibilities named. The most dangerous ambiguity, whether the system existed at all, was removed. What remained unseen was no longer unacknowledged. The resolution settled unevenly, but it held. Stability no longer relied entirely on secrecy. Transparency no longer demanded rigidity. The system learned to operate with selective visibility, preserving flexibility while restoring trust. Light did not replace shadow. It outlined it. What endured from this final chapter was a difficult lesson. Some systems function precisely because they allow human judgment to fill gaps rules cannot anticipate. But judgment without legitimacy cannot endure. Effectiveness without explanation eventually collapses under suspicion. The system that worked only in the shadows survived by stepping just far enough into view, not to be controlled, but to be understood. So, what do you think? Can a system remain flexible once we demand to see it? The